Let's talk a little bit about adjectives and then the way they work in Spanish. Like in English, we use adjectives in Spanish to describe people and things. That is the purpose of adjectives, modifying and describing nouns and pronouns. However, there are some differences in how adjectives work in Spanish compared to how they work in English. We're going to take a look at a couple of those in this mini lesson. First of all, adjectives are going to agree with the gender of the nouns they describe. In English, we don't have separate forms of adjectives for masculine and feminine, but oftentimes in Spanish, we're actually going to find that there's a masculine form of adjectives and there's a feminine form of adjectives. For example, let's take a look at this man. Él es artístico. Él es artístico. Notice that the adjective artístico ends in the letter O because we're describing a man. Él es artístico. However, if we're talking about a woman or a girl, we would not say ella es artístico, rather we would say ella es artística. Ella es artística. So you see we have both a masculine form, artístico, ending in O, and a feminine form, artística, ending in A. It is very important that you get that because you cannot say ella es artístico. That will be incorrect. You have to make your adjectives agree with the gender of the nouns you're describing. So many adjectives have both a masculine and a feminine form. Alright? The rule is this: if the adjective ends in O, there's going to be also a feminine form that ends in the letter A. For example, we could say Roberto es simpático. Roberto's nice. If we're talking about La Señora Davis, we could say La Señora Davis es simpática. Simpático is the masculine form. Simpática is the feminine form. Okay? Some adjectives actually don't end in O, but you'll still have a feminine form. One example that we see from this lesson is the word trabajador. Juan es trabajador. That ends in DOR. Most adjectives that end in DOR will require you to add an A to make them feminine. So if you're talking about Silvia, you say Silvia es trabajadora. There are a number of adjectives like that end in dor, that end in dora for the feminine form. So instead of changing the O to an A, because there's not an O at the end of it, you're actually going to add the A. Trabajador, trabajadora. Okay? Now then, some adjectives actually don't have separate forms for masculine and feminine. A lot of times these end in the letter E. For example, él es impaciente. Él es impaciente. If we're talking about her, on the right, we would say ella es impaciente. Notice that there's not a separate masculine and a feminine form. Same thing with the word sociable. Pablo es sociable. Lucy, también, es sociable. Sociable, sociable. So notice again, that's the form for both the masculine and the feminine. Alright? Now also if an adjective ends in ista, that ends in the letter A. However, don't be confused. If a word ends in ista, that is both the masculine and the feminine form. We don't have isto. For example, if you say Julián, Julián es deportista. Julián is sports-minded. But if we're talking about Victoria, Victoria es deportista. Notice we don't say Julián es deportisto. That word doesn't exist in Spanish. Deportisto doesn't exist. We would say Julián es deportista. So that's both the masculine and the feminine form. Okay? So remember, however, that in Spanish every noun is either masculine or feminine. Not just people, but every noun. We talked about that in the previous lesson. So adjectives are also going to agree with them. For example, we're talking about the color of the book. El libro es rojo. Libro is a masculine noun, so we'll say el libro es rojo. We're talking about the color of a computer, however. The word for computer in Spanish is feminine. La computadora es roja. Rojo, roja. So remember, you don't just have to pay attention to whether people are masculine and feminine when you're talking about making adjectives agree, but you also have to look at every noun. Is it masculine or feminine? This is why gender is so important, because adjectives and articles such as el and la will agree with them. They're chameleons. Think of them as chameleons that they change to match up with whether the noun is masculine or the noun is feminine. So in summary, adjectives, just like in English, describe people and things. They describe nouns and pronouns. In Spanish, many adjectives have a masculine form that often ends in O and a feminine form that often ends in A. You're going to have to make the adjective agree with the gender of the nouns that they describe.